My name is Abigail May Thornton. I'm 36. I live in Seattle, in a narrow townhouse pressed between a bakery that never closes and an old bookstore that smells like rain and decisions I haven't made. For the last 6 years I've been married to Mark Hawthorne, who is patient in the way a harbor is patient with a small fishing boat. Steady, predictable, sometimes indifferent to storms. I work as a nurse in a long-term care facility. Most nights I come home with a ghost scent of hand lotion and antiseptic on my skin, and a brain full of other people's endings. Emotionally, I'm exhausted and quietly proud and very, very careful. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. Today I'm back in the place where everything started, the small town of Willow Creek, Connecticut. A town whose main street still remembers every childhood transgression of mine. The church where my sister is getting married sits on a gentle hill, white clapboard warmed by the late spring sun. I remember how we used to race down that hill on our bikes until we split apart from breath and heat. The air here smells of cut grass and lilacs, and the church bells have a softness that feels cruel, as if they are reminding me that time keeps moving even when people keep clinging. My sister, Claire Donovan, is 32. We are 3 years apart, and most of our lives have been a history of balancing acts. Claire stayed in Willow Creek. She kept old promises like heirlooms. She worked at the diner, she married the town's grief in small, practical ways. And when our mother started to unravel, Claire wrapped herself around the pieces. Me. Left. I left before I knew how to run from anything except the way our mother's voice could make a room feel smaller. I left with rented boxes and a scholarship and a hope that leaving was an answer. That's how I became the family member who could leave and therefore, I thought, be forgiven. The pews in the church smell like wax and wood polish. The sun made the stained glass confess its colors into the aisle. When I walked up to my row, Mark held my hand the way he always does. Fingers interlaced like a small, practical contract. He'd driven up with me last night. We had a cheap dinner at a truck stop because everything in Willow Creek after 9 feels like it's agreeing to shut down with you. He was nervous in the way he always is during family things. Tentative, eyes darting, making small jokes to diffuse tension. I thought I knew where everything sat. My marriage, my loyalty to Claire, the old wounds tucked into the folds of my life like photos in a shoebox. I thought I had rehearsed every possible thing. Claire's fiancé, Tom, is an easy man to like. Wide-shouldered, kind when he thinks no one is watching. Their engagement felt like something the town had orchestrated to prove we could still make simple narratives. Love, proposal, ring, candlelit dance. Claire looked like she had been painted into the scene with careful brushes. Her dress elbow-length lace, hair pinned with a comb she borrowed from our grandmother. She carried a bouquet of white peonies and a nervous glow that could make me believe in first acts again. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. The service began with a soft piano. The organist played hymns I recognized from every funeral and baptism I've tended at work. I watched Claire's hands tremble as she smoothed the front of her dress, watched Tom angle himself protectively. I held Mark's hand because that's what you do when the world hums with vows and promises you aren't sure you can trust. The church was full, not a seat left empty, but there was an oddness in the hush, a collective leaning forward as if we were all about to hear something private. There had been friction lately, quiet things, conversations clipped at family dinners, Claire's voice trailing off when someone mentioned the trip she took last summer. But in Willow Creek, certain things are always framed as small. The secrets that look like petty crimes until they become cataclysms. Our mother, Lillian, was there in the third pew. Hair done in a way that said she had tried. She had learned to smile in public. My father wasn't. He had left when Claire was 12. That absence is a kind of weather here. Wind that knocks over porch furniture and doesn't apologize. The ceremony moved like an old river. Steady, familiar, and then suddenly a stone dropped. Claire had reached for Tom's hands. The officiant's voice softened. The congregation leaned in. And then Mark leaned toward me. Not for the communion, not for a whisper about the weather, and he spoke. "She's the real bride," he breathed. It was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it. a coincidence of his mouth and the hymns. But the man behind me, Tom's brother who was 2 seats away, had his head tilt. Claire's smile paused. Someone's choir muffler hit a wrong note. I felt my stomach drop like an anchor cut loose. Everyone turned to me. The room held its breath in a way that made my skin buzz. I could feel my heart trying to climb its own ribs. For a moment no one spoke. My hands loosened on Mark's fingers as if I might drop them to the floor, and they would shatter into townsfolk gossip and old resentments. I heard my own voice in my head like someone else's. The image of a woman who leaves, who remakes herself. Mark's eyes were on my face. There was something in them I hadn't seen in years. The kind of messy, bare honesty he usually reserved for the solitude of our car on long drives. My mouth wanted to say it was a joke, a slip, a misremembered phrase. My feet felt rooted to the carpet. If you've ever been at the mercy of a single sentence in a crowd, you know what happened next. People start to unspool. Heads turn. Conversations shift like a tide. My mother's hand gripped the edge of the pew. Claire's face went a color of paper, and in that color I saw the outline of a past I didn't know how to read. Mark's whisper had detonated in the stillness of the church, and we were left trying to pick up shards. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. The truth is, nothing in my life until that second had ever felt so precise as the way the world focused on me. I felt naked not because clothes were missing but because the story that had been quietly living in the margins of our lives had suddenly been given a headline. I don't finish this part without saying, I had reasons for the choices I'd made. We all do. But in that moment, in the middle of my sister's wedding, with the entire congregation's attention pinned like a moth to my chest, every reason I kept for myself began to tremble. The church was full of people who had once agreed to carry me. They were now watching to see what I would do with the weight of the reveal Mark had handed me like an accusation. I remember the smell, lilies and wax, and the presence of people leaning forward, hungry for a rupture. I remember Mark's breath on my ear and the warmth of his hand that had steadied me for years. I remember Claire, the bride, a halo of honest joy that now looked as fragile as a soap bubble. And I remember thinking, with the clarity of someone falling, that the word bride had just become a map with a missing key. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. But first I have to tell you everything that led us to that pew. I could hear the pastor clear his throat, a small reflex trying to stitch a garment of normalcy back over the room. But someone had already undone it. Tom's mother, who had never liked me but who had always been polite, stood up as if she'd been rehearsed to respond to scandal. There was a clutter of murmurs. What did he say? Is he joking? Is this some kind of... The piano stuttered. Mark squeezed my fingers like he needed a map that only my skin could provide. His lips moved again, quieter this time, but this time the words came not as a blow but as a kind of confession. Abby, I'm sorry. I should have told you. I should have said something years ago. Telling me, in the middle of my sister's wedding, felt like a deliberate exposure. I wanted to pull his face to mine and ask him if he was aware that his timing could kill a room. But the thing about betrayals is they are not only about timing. Betrayals are about the accumulation of small, unremarked-on omissions that turn into avalanches. I had been holding a life together with tape. His whisper had been a match. Tell me what? I heard myself say, but it came out soft, like someone who had been underwater and was afraid to sound like they'd breathe again. Mark looked like he might crack. Years ago, he began, voice low. Before you and I, before Willow Creek, Claire and I. We were young, drunk, stupid. We went to Vegas. We were in a bad place. We got married for a night. We meant it like it didn't mean anything. Left. I thought it was nothing. I thought it was the kind of mistake you bury. I never filed anything. Tom's jaw tightened. The man seated at the front, Claire's father, stood, the color draining from his face. He had not been around for many of the things Claire had carried, but he had the old gravity of a small-town man who knows legal forms more than feelings. His voice cracked. You're telling me my daughter is married to my daughters? Not married now, Mark tried. I thought we were done with it. We separated that week. We never pursued it. I thought the paperwork never filed if you don't pursue. Mark. Snap. I didn't mean for the word to carry that much force. But the room felt like a courtroom, and my voice is not a strong one in court. You didn't tell me because you didn't want to see the fallout, I said, and the words surprised me by their heat. You didn't tell me because you wanted the story to remain convenient. Claire sank into the nearest pew like someone pushed her off a cliff, and she had to learn to suspend her limbs midair. Is this true? She whispered to Mark, though the world already seemed certain. Is any of this true? Mark's confession loosened other things. It came out in frayed edges, names, nights, money paid for a motel in a town they had promised not to name, little details that made it real. He was not a politician of apology. He was a man with a foot in two lives who had believed in erasing by ignoring. I watched my sister process the fact that the man she had loved, her first lover perhaps, or one of her youthful ghosts, had been the thing that stitched him to me. All the small, invisible loyalties we had built, loyalty to family, to choices made at 20, to the myth of the person we pretend to be, unraveled. Claire's face was not outrage at first. It was bewilderment, the kind that washes you clean of illusions. Around us, whispers multiplied into narrative. Someone mentioned a courthouse file. Someone checked a phone. Tom's brother, who had been playing a part in the wedding party, stood with his lips pursed, the old protective instincts of family showing themselves like scabs. We need to call the county clerk, he said. We need proof. I should have left right then. The sensible moves were clear. Call a lawyer, step outside, breathe. Instead I stayed. Because settling into the role of the one betrayed is a kind of addiction. It is a place where the world will look at you with pity or attention. And I had not had either for a long time. At home, at work, you are often invisible. Here suddenly everything in Willow Creek had permission to point. My mother didn't know whom to hit. She hit the back of her head with her palm, a habitual gesture she used when she was trying to distract herself from things she could not control. You had to understand. Lillian had a way of making drama into a currency. She had spent years bargaining with other people's sympathy, and suddenly the bank was open. She looked at Claire and then at me and then at Mark, as if the room were a stage and she wanted to know who was supposed to play which part. Tom's fingers were white on his bouquet. He did not look like a man who could be a footnote in someone else's narrative. He looked like a man whose wedding day had been vitiated by a past no one considered before. If this is some kind of joke, he said, that's not funny. This is my life. This is my daughter's life. Claire's life. The word hit me like something sharp. Claire had always been the one who could claim the town's respect by simple occupancy. She had built her life very intentionally. Stay, care, love where you choose. The idea that Mark and Claire might have had a part of each other once felt like a secret that had been eatable. It tasted bitter. I started to feel faint, like someone had pulled all the oxygen out of the church and replaced it with a smell I couldn't place. Guilt and old beer and the iron tang of panic. I thought of the small choices Mark and I had made together. Apartment, wedding, the small emergency we called the couch move, the nights he sat with me while I ached from an endless shift. Where did the past shuffle into present? How many people build their marriages on the absence of inconvenient truths and call it stability? Please, Claire said, voice small. Please don't do this to me. Her plea wasn't to the congregation. It was to Mark and to me and to everyone else who kept a secret and thought it would stay secret because they had stopped tending it. The line between personal responsibility and public collapse blurred. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to make it known that I was not an accessory to the omission. But then, like a stream slowly revealing the bed beneath, other things surfaced. Names of nights my mother had left us alone, the time Claire didn't tell father where she was, the old argument about who had taken the last of the birthday money. All of it combined into a narrative that made me feel both like a villain and an innocent at once. There were practicalities. Tom's attorney cousin called from the parking lot. Someone pulled up the state vital records on a phone. I remember the little blue light of it like a lighthouse in a storm. There were murmurs about whether a marriage entered in Vegas without intent can be nullified. There were faces turning to me, not with curiosity exactly, but with something more diagnostic, like a group of doctors looking for symptoms. Mark kept looking at me like he wanted me to choose his side. I kept looking at Claire as if all the years we had navigated the same river had ended in this sudden waterfall. And under it, beneath the noise, was the deeper thing that none of us wanted to name. We weren't just dealing with a legal technicality. We were standing on top of the unhealed parts of our family, the parts we'd smoothed with excuses. This whisper had been the match that found old fuel. "Can we please step out?" I finally said, not to Mark but to the room, to the idea that maybe we could salvage dignity by moving this conversation away from the pews. No one moved. The pastor had both hands up, part shepherd, part mediator, trying to keep a mass of people from turning private grief into public entertainment. That was where the fracture truly began. Once the public spectacle started, there was no returning to private betrayal. The world insisted on seeing and therefore turning the story into something that belonged to everyone. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest part of being betrayed. Not the act itself, but the way it invites a town to rummage through your drawers for clues they can use to make sense of their own lonely nights. If this has you holding your breath like I did, then know this. It isn't over. The truth kept getting uglier and more mundane at the same time, like a wound that won't scar because people keep picking at it. In the next part, I'll tell you what I did when everyone finally stopped watching and I had to decide what a life without Mark might look like. We finally stepped out onto the church's back porch like two people who had been asked to perform a mercy killing for their own dignity. The air was cooler there. Maple trees lined the yard, and someone had hung paper lanterns that fluttered like small ghosts. People clustered in groups, forming formations that looked oddly like judgment booths. I remember Mark's breath smelled of coffee and regret. He sat on an old pew discarded for the reception and looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "I should have told you," he said again, as if repetition could build a bridge. "I wanted to. I told myself I would. Paperwork. Abby, I thought it was nothing when I left. I thought." He stopped because he didn't have a place to finish. We both didn't, not really. For my part, my mind was a ledger. I counted the ways he had been my partner. At midnight feverish shifts, holding my hand through uncertain diagnoses, buying the couch we couldn't afford because it made the living room ours. I counted also what I had allowed myself not to ask. The gaps in his past, the name that used to come up in his stories and that he'd always softened around. "How long?" I asked. The word "how" sat heavy like a question that could measure the depth of a wound. 14 years, he said. "It was years ago. I thought it ended. I didn't divorce. I didn't pursue it, Abby. I didn't contact her. I never wanted to hurt you." He said those last 3 words like an attempt to stitch the rest of what he'd destroyed. I felt something hot and furious inside me, the type of anger that isn't purely for yourself, but for the account of kind deeds given value by nothing. For the nights he came home and I believed in the narrative of him loving me. For the nights I told myself the sound of traffic outside our window was just city living, not an echo of him walking other streets. "What does Claire think?" I asked because that was the question that mattered in the moral geography of the town. "What does Tom think?" Mark's jaw worked. "I told Claire about Vegas a few months ago," he said. "She came to me one night. She said she couldn't stop thinking about it, about that summer when everything was a mess. Talk. We didn't." He stopped again. "We didn't think it would matter." Claire had thought about it. She had sat with a truth that most people file into compartments and label X's or mistakes. She had sat on it and decided to build a life regardless. That she had chosen security, stability. Tom wasn't a betrayal of the past. It was a deliberate act of moving forward. And yet past and present had collided in a way that felt like family violence. Old impulses wrecking new, carefully assembled hope. There was a knock at the back door of the church and Tom's brother came out waving a small slip of paper. The county's marriage records were open on his phone and the tiny font said what we know might mean the rest of our lives change. "It's here," he said. "There was a license, Clark County. 2009. It's got both their names." I felt the floor shift. My knees wanted to go soft, but I held myself rigid like a soldier in a parade. Counting steps, counting breaths. Mark's eyes went to mine, and he looked like a man about to fall. He placed his hands on my shoulders, a benediction or a plea I couldn't untangle. "You could have told me," I said, more fact than accusation now. "Not like this. Not on her wedding day." "I know," he said. "I know. I was a coward." Cowardice is a word that often hides fear in the shadow of contempt. I felt my anger cool into something else. Sorrow, surprisingly. There was a part of me, fundamental and small, that had always wanted to forgive, to make a life where we were both whole because we had chosen it, not because we had been given it by convenience. That part of me wanted to ask how we'd gotten here. But then Claire walked out of the church and I watched her face. The paper color matched to something old. Her breathing shallow, the bouquet limp between her hands. "Abby," she said, and for a second the sisterly affection that had attached our pasts fluttered like a flag. "I didn't want any of this." "Neither did I answered, which was true. Some sentences are useful because they are accurate, not because they make you feel better. We had dinner later that day at the reception because, in Willow Creek especially, you eat around the truth until the edges become softer. The room was a blur of plates and the clinking of forks. Tom had disappeared. The groom was not present for the main course. He had retreated with his mother and brother to a rented car, consulting on whether to call off the marriage or to proceed and trust legal counsel. The band tried to play and the music sounded like a consolation prize. People came up to me with eyes like petty judges. "Why didn't you know? Is this a lie? Are you okay?" This last question was the one I resented most. The assumption that I would be the one to weather it and keep my face composed. The truth is I was not okay. My hands shook in the bright lights of the hall. My appetite was thin. I drifted through conversations like a ghost ordered to haunt a family function. I kept seeing Mark's face turn ashen whenever someone asked him a question he couldn't answer. He was apologizing to people whose names I didn't know, and every apology seemed to expend more of his air. That night, back at the hotel, I didn't sleep. Not because of the legal possibilities or the gossip, that was all loud and messy and obvious, but because of how small the world had felt suddenly, compressed into the one fact that a man I loved had a past he thought he could keep in a box. I thought about the nights I woke alone. I thought about how many times I'd offered my body and an open ear and considered them sufficient. I thought about the difference between being chosen and being convenient. We sat in the hotel room and spoke in a voice like glass being sanded. Mark said again the parts of the truth that tasted like salt. He said he had married Claire in a ceremony that neither intended to mean forever. He said they had been naive, injured, and young. He said he'd never filed the papers. He said the guilt had gnawed at him. He said he had tried to bury the past by building a life with me because he believed in the way we loved when we were awake together. "Why didn't you come clean?" I asked, though I could guess. "Why keep Claire at arm's length and build this marriage with me?" The answer was prosaic and rooted in fear. People keep things because they are afraid of losing what they have. They sit on confessions like contraband and hope the weight of them will make them less real. He had kept it because he thought ignorance could be kindness. He had been trying to shelter me, and in doing so he had entombed us in a different kind of violence, a private betrayal masquerading as protection. I thought of our apartment in Seattle, of the way Mark had smoked too many cigarettes on the balcony and told me jokes that were small and false. I thought of celebrating my promotion last spring and him buying a cheap bouquet with a $10 bill tucked into the petals. I thought of the richness of ordinary life and whether it was richer than an honesty that could hurt. "I don't know what I want to do," I said finally. "I don't know if this is reparable." We argued in circles until tears blurred the cityscape beyond the window. We spoke about law and about love and about loyalty. I remember saying something I didn't expect to say. "You should have told your sister the truth the night it mattered, when you were both raw enough to see what you had done. Not later. Not when the town gathered to celebrate stability. Honesty isn't a last-minute charity, Mark. It's a commitment." He hugged me then. Not the quick, soft assurance he offers when I'm sick, but a long, regretful grasp. "I'm sorry," he said. "I made a mistake. I want to fix it." There are ways to fix things that involve forms and lawyers and apologies. There are ways to fix things that require more. Returning to a person you hurt and telling them that you were wrong. I didn't know which kind of fix this would ask for. I did know one thing. A community had been given the right to watch our unraveling. They would now, forever after, have a script. And if anything I had ever wanted in my life was something beyond scripts, some version of peace that wasn't curated for other people's comfort, then this was the moment to want it. In the morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I called in sick to work for the day and then 2 more days. I drove out to the county clerk's office and sat in a waiting room that smelled faintly of old dust and bureaucracy. There are practicalities to betrayal. Signatures, notarized statements, requests to rescind, motions filed. But there are also the human administrative tasks. Who tells friends, who tells employers, who says we're changing our story? And for the first time in a long while, I felt the composition of my life as something I could actually change. If you're following this and feel your chest tighten, it's because truth is heavy. In the next part, I'll tell you how Claire and I navigated what it meant to be sisters after everything came unglued. How we found in the wreckage the outlines of something like repair. The days immediately after the wedding were a landscape of small, practical violence. Phone calls, texts that arrived like tiny landmines, people showing up at my door with casseroles and sympathies that tasted like blood. Mark moved into a friend's apartment for a week because neither of us could stand the sight of the other's face without flinching. We tried to agree on language. What we would tell neighbors, what we would write. We tried to create a narrative that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. We failed often. Claire and I began to speak in a more deliberate way than we had in years. Our relationship had always been a complicated barter. I had left, but I sent money when I could. She had stayed and taken the brunt of our mother's unpredictable moods. Now our conversations were not the small sisterly exchanges of recipes and gossip. They were confessions, boxing gloves turned into truth-tellers. We met at a cafe that smelled like burned coffee and honest light. And for the first time since that morning at the church, I watched Claire without the lens of assumed roles. "I didn't know," she said. It wasn't a defense. It was an admission. She had, when Mark first mentioned something years ago, chosen not to pursue it because pain can become a way of managing. I thought I could survive by pretending it had been nothing. I thought if I didn't dig, it wouldn't hurt. I was angry, I admitted. Angry at him. Angry at myself for showing up anywhere near a man with a past he couldn't own. Angry at the whole idea that people can opt not to be honest and make others clean up the fallout. We talked about our mother, Lillian, and the way she had treated secrets like currency. We recognized that we had inherited a pattern, avoidance masquerading as protection. We also recognized that we had the power, painfully new and thin, to refuse it. Claire decided to postpone the wedding. Tom, to his credit, was not without pain, but he was fair. He said he needed time and legal counsel and didn't want to make a martyr of himself or Claire. He said he loved her for who she was now, not for an accident of a drunken night. For me, the pressing task was to figure out whether Mark and I could be something honest. There is a brutal clarity in deciding to stay with someone after betrayal. Staying requires a kind of rebuilding that is not glamorous. It is paperwork and therapy and an endless repetition of the reasons you chose each other, and the reasons you will choose each other again. I went to couples counseling with Mark. We sat across from a woman with artfully short hair who asked us to remember the moment we first fell in love. Mark cried. Cried too. It was messy and, in small ways, it was also beautiful. But part of healing, I learned, is not to allow romantic notions to stand in for structural ones. Mark's confession meant that some things couldn't be repaired by apologies and promises alone. There would need to be documents, legal clarifications, perhaps annulments. To me, though, the legalities were an outer echo of a more important inner work. The ability to speak truth when it hurt. One morning, after a sleepless night, I packed a small bag and drove to my mother's house. Lillian had called me once, voice trembling, saying she wanted to talk. I thought it might be about Claire or the town's gossips. Instead, Lillian sat me down and for the first time in my life said out loud things she'd always kept to herself. That she had felt lost when she was young, that she'd taken refuge in the bottle because life had been too heavy, that my father's absence had hollowed her in ways she couldn't fix. She apologized for not seeing the ways her absence had shaped us. The apology was not a cure, but it was a crack through which some light could come. I told her about Mark's confession, and to my surprise she did not gasp or judge. She sat, hands in her lap, and for the first time I saw her not as a problem but as a person who had aged into her decisions. "You have to protect yourself, Abby," she said. "Not because you don't forgive, but because people will always choose their comfort over your heart if you let them." It was the kind of brutal, loving thing only a parent can say when they've done damage and are trying to be honest about it. I left her house feeling only slightly lighter, the way you feel when you breathe in a room you've been holding your breath in. Work became an island of normalcy and also an arena where I was recognized for my competence rather than my scandal. At the nursing facility, residents and colleagues gave me an unspoken permission to be bruised without explanation. It was strange to feel anonymous and known in different places. I slept poorly, my mind rehearsing scenes. Mark's whisper in the church, Claire's blank face, my mother's small apology. I learned to name the feelings. Humiliation, grief, the sharp, clean sort of anger that feels like a useful tool if wielded carefully. Claire and I did something else that was unexpected. We started going on long walks together, talking about our childhood like archaeologists dusting off something we had both overlooked. She spoke about the loneliness that had made her reckless in her 20s. I told her about the nights I had decided leaving was the only way to survive. We did not heal overnight. We did, however, learn to recognize the outlines of each other's pain and to hold them without offering platitudes. That felt monumental. Legal procedures took their course. The county clerk confirmed that there had been a marriage license filed in 2009. Names, dates, signatures. There was confusion in the documents, enough to allow for an annulment on the grounds of lack of intent, but the process required Claire to choose. She could seek annulment and clear the record. She could also do nothing and let the legalities go adrift. She chose to seek annulment, not because she needed to marry Tom, but because she didn't want her life to be footnoted by a mistake she hadn't made. Tom returned with more patience than I expected. He and Claire met in the town square under the same sycamore where they had once carved their initials. There was no fanfare about it. They sat and discussed what the future should feel like. Honest, deliberate, without the shadow of a past left to smolder. I watched from a distance, feeling something like relief and also a mournful sadness for the simpler stories we'd all assumed we could tell ourselves. I could have left Mark. Many nights I considered packing everything into my car and driving west until Seattle became a silver line on the horizon. I thought about revenge in petty, satisfying ways, telling every mutual acquaintance, posting the whole thing like a confession, stepping into a new life where I would be both the injured and the avenger. In the end, I chose something else. I chose to stay and demand truth, or to leave and demand peace. Mark and I worked on our marriage. Not in grand sweeping gestures, but in the hard, small commitments that actually change a life. He filled out the paperwork to clear his previous marriage. He told everyone he had loved and hurt. He signed documents. He went to meetings about honesty. The process of making a life again, for both of us, was like fixing a house with termites. You have to gut the infested walls and rebuild. There were days of tenderness, quiet mornings with coffee and no hidden topics, and days of setbacks, phone calls that reopened old wounds. But the rhythm of repair was present in the small things. Mark showing up for therapy, Claire allowing him a human-size front porch in her life rather than a principal chair, my mother admitting she had been frightened and leaving us with the promise she would try to be better. If you're still with me, thank you. It took months before the gossip faded enough that the town could talk about the weather again, and not our lives. It took longer for me to stop waking in the night with my chest tight. And even now, I catch myself sometimes, thinking of the church and the sound of Mark's breath against my ear when he said those words. There is no neat moral here, no tidy restoration of everything that was broken. There are, however, lessons that settled into me like small, useful stones. In part 5, I will tell you the hardest truth I learned. About agency, about the difference between being forgiven and being repaired, and about the way a whisper in a church can change the course of many lives, if you let it. Time, in Willow Creek, is patient and cruel. It keeps everything in slow motion, allowing rumors to ossify and then eventually crumble under the weight of better days. The annex of our lives, the part that had been put under glass and labeled scandal, began to cool. People who had stood in judgment became those who nodded as if they'd learned something about the fragility of human arrangements. Not everyone forgave. Not everyone needed to. But the town moved on in a way that felt both humane and ordinary. My marriage with Mark survived, though not without cost and without change. We decided that rebuilding required honesty at the level of plumbing. We needed to see how the water ran through our house and make sure there were no hidden leaks. We set boundaries. No more omitted pasts, no more unilateral decisions about what to reveal and what to bury. He told me everything he could remember about that night in Vegas. The motel, the neon, the way the world had made a young man think marriage was a prank, and he stopped romanticizing the story. He accepted, finally, that his omission had been an act that deployed me as a convenience. He had the decency, later, to call it by its name. Claire and Tom did eventually get married. Not in the church that had nearly detonated them, but at a small beach where the tide rendered all human frailty to sand. It was a modest ceremony. A handful of friends, my mother in a dress that didn't try too hard, Tom's mother who had the grace to look like she had been to a funeral and decided to celebrate instead. They married with intention. Claire, in the months between the scandal and the ceremony, did something hard. She grieved her past. She saw a therapist and spoke about the way her younger self used relationships to fill a hole that nothing could fill. It wasn't pretty work, but it was honest work. And it made the vows she later gave feel earned. As for my mother, things shifted. She attended AA meetings. She wrote me a letter one afternoon, folded and thin, admitting she had used us as buffers from her own fear. "I thought if I could hold on to you by making you need me, I'd still be needed," she wrote. "It was selfish. I'm sorry." The letter didn't fix everything. It did, however, allow me to stop protecting her from the consequences of her choices, because I had once protected my own heart from having to accept them. That was a small liberation. Change jobs. Not because I had to, but because the old life no longer fit me the way the molting of a bird's feathers no longer fits the same sky. I moved into a different wing of the hospital where the work was harder but the humanity clearer. I learned to sleep in a way that felt like the body and not just the mind resting. I learned to ask for what I needed. I learned, painfully, to trust my instincts rather than the soothing voice of habit. There is one evening that sits in my chest like a jewel. It was a year after the wedding. Claire and I sat on my porch in Seattle, a package of cheap wine between us, rain making the world smell like clean things. She toasted, not to weddings or to men, but to honesty, to the work we had both done. We spoke about our mother, about our father, about the ways we'd been shaped and the ways we were choosing new patterns. "You know," Claire said, swirling the wine, "when Mark whispered that day, I felt like my life had been stolen on principle. But the thing is, what he said forced us to see what had been hidden. It didn't make us victims. It made us people who could choose." I thought about that a long time. What is a choice? Often, it's an act of agency that occurs when the world is messy. We are taught to equate staying with loyalty and leaving with cowardice. But real choice allows for both fidelity and self-respect. Sometimes the brave thing is to rebuild, sometimes it's to walk out. The point is to act with clarity. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not romantic. It's not one of those tidy moral conclusions that fit in a bumper sticker. It's that honesty is expensive and necessary. Secrets carry a price that doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it arrives as the hush of a church and sometimes as the quiet of a kitchen late at night. The most important vows are not the ones made in public. They're the ones we make to ourselves about what we'll accept and what we won't tolerate. People still ask me, in the occasional small-town encounter or at the grocery store, "Are you okay?" And I answer, "I'm learning." Because it's true. I'm learning that pain can be an instruction manual if you pay attention, that boundaries are a form of love for yourself and for those you stay with, and that forgiveness is a process, not a one-time decree. I no longer define myself as the woman who gets betrayed. I define myself as someone who, given the choice, will prefer truth. Not because truth will keep me from harm, but because it allows me to live in a world where my life is not an accessory to someone else's cowardice. If this story has stayed with you, if you feel the echo of a whisper in your own life, consider sharing it or leaving a comment. Has something like this changed the way you see your relationships? I'm reading everything and your stories matter. A like helps more of us find one another in the dark. When Mark and I renewed our vows, quietly without fanfare, in the backyard under the maple, we did it with different words. I didn't ask for a promise that pain wouldn't find us again. I asked for a promise that we would speak out loud when it did. He promised. I promised to remember who I am if the world asked me to pretend otherwise. We planted a small tree afterward, something living and slow-growing, a reminder that repair is incremental and messy and worth the work. Everyone turned to me in a church that day when Mark whispered, "She's the real bride." The turn of heads felt like accusation, like a demand for spectacle. But what came after? Months of hard conversation, legal paperwork, therapy, quiet apologies, and the slow building of new habits, became the thing that mattered. The whisper did what whispers do. It irritated the surface until something deeper could be seen. This doesn't end with perfect peace. We carry the scars, and sometimes the town remembers better than people forgive. But we also carry the knowledge of our choices. I live now with a strange kind of gratitude. For the ache that taught me boundaries, for the betrayal that showed me the brittle places within me, and for the sister who, despite everything, taught me how to survive and how to choose. If this story meant something to you, and if you think someone else might find strength from it, please consider subscribing and sharing. There is always more to say, and the quiet work of being honest is one of the hardest things we do. Thank you for listening.